The air inside Blackwood Auction House carried the scent of hay and old leather. The steady sound of hooves on packed dirt mixed with quiet conversations and occasional laughter. Men in fine suits and polished shoes moved through the stables, studying the horses for sale with expert eyes. For them, this was more than business. It was a display of wealth, a chance to show power through high bids. And among them, Henry Callahan stood out sharply. His face, worn by years of sun and hard work, was a clear contrast to the smooth, confident expressions around him. His faded shirt and worn vest marked him as an outsider. But what truly drew attention wasn't the man, it was the magnificent white stallion beside him. Named Silver Dust, the horse was breathtaking. His coat shone under the stable lights, his muscles moved with each step, and his intelligent eyes took in the room with quiet awareness. He was a purebred Arabian, a horse of unmatched lineage. But to Henry, Silver Dust was more than a pedigree. He was the last piece of a life that had slowly fallen apart. At 72, Henry had lost everything. Years of drought had ruined his land, unpaid debts had taken his ranch. The world had moved on without him. Now, with no other choice, he had come to sell the only thing that had ever truly mattered. As Henry entered the auction hall, leading Silver Dust by the reins, heads turned. Some buyers whispered, others chuckled. A young man in a beige suit murmured to his companion, "Probably a stable hand who wandered in by mistake." The other replied with a smirk. Henry ignored them and stepped toward the appraisal area where a group of buyers stood. The auctioneer, a man with a thin mustache and an impatient air, glanced at his notes and frowned. He asked, adjusting his glasses. "Yes," Henry said, keeping his voice steady, "Silver Dust has a flawless pedigree. I raised and trained him myself." A deep, amused voice interrupted. The words came from Charles Davenport, a powerful horse breeder in an expensive black suit. His smirk carried nothing but contempt. The horse might look impressive, but it came from a bankrupt ranch. A murmur swept through the room. Some buyers chuckled, others folded their arms, watching Henry with curiosity as if he were a spectacle. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Silence, nothing, not a single hand went up. The room erupted into laughter. Henry clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the reins. His heart pounded not with anger but with something deeper, a quiet, unshakable certainty. They didn't understand. They didn't see Silver Dust for what he truly was. To these men, he was just another horse from a forgotten man. Taking a deep breath, Henry lifted his chin and spoke, his voice firm. "None of you have any idea what you're about to lose." The laughter faded. An uneasy silence settled over the stable. Buyers exchanged puzzled glances, some furrowed their brows, but no one expected what Henry was about to reveal next. A tense silence hung in the air. The laughter from moments ago faded into uneasy murmurs. The men in suits, so sure of their own knowledge, now watched Henry with narrowed eyes. What did he mean? What secret could a washed-up rancher possibly hold? Even the auctioneer, ready to dismiss him, hesitated. Henry didn't rush. He let them stew in their own curiosity as he gently ran a hand over Silver Dust's powerful neck. Finally, he spoke. "This horse," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "isn't just some forgotten stallion from a bankrupt ranch." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The name Stormborn was practically folklore among horse breeders. A stallion with an undefeated record, unmatched endurance, and a bloodline thought lost decades ago. Charles Davenport, who had mocked Henry minutes before, stepped forward, his smirk gone. "That's impossible," he scoffed, but there was an edge of doubt in his voice. Stormborn's bloodline was believed extinct. Henry met his gaze with unwavering confidence. He reached into his worn vest pocket and pulled out a folded document, an original pedigree certificate, aged and yellowed but still intact. The auctioneer took the paper with careful hands, scanning it quickly. His face paled. It was real. The murmurs grew louder, shifting from disbelief to frantic speculation. If Henry was telling the truth, Silver dust wasn't just valuable, he was priceless. Every major breeder in the country would want a horse with this lineage. The men who had laughed at Henry moments ago now eyed silver dust with newfound hunger. Davenport clenched his jaw, realizing his mistake. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit it, but Henry could see it in his eyes: regret. The same men who had mocked him, who had bid $10 as a joke, now stood silent, uncertain, and desperate. Henry exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spent his entire life overlooked, dismissed, treated like nothing. But today he had reminded them all of something they had forgotten. Straightening his posture, Henry turned to the auctioneer. For a moment no one spoke. The weight of Henry's revelation settled over the auction hall like a storm cloud. The same men who had sneered at him were now frozen, their minds racing. A direct descendant of Stormborn. This wasn't just any horse. This was history, power, and prestige wrapped in muscle and bone. The auctioneer, still gripping the aged pedigree document, cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting from amused indifference to sharp professionalism. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice more measured now, "given this new information, we'll restart the bidding." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The same horse they had laughed at minutes ago now had a starting price 5,000 times higher than the insultingly low bid of $10. A tense pause filled the air. Then, without hesitation, a man in the front raised his hand. Another called, his voice rushed and eager. Davenport, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. His pride had taken a hit, but he wouldn't let himself walk away empty-handed. He said, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. The other buyers weren't backing down, though. The numbers climbed at a dizzying speed, voices growing louder, more desperate. Henry stood still, watching as the same men who had mocked his horse, his life, his very presence in that auction hall, now fought like rabid dogs for the chance to own silver dust. Part of him wanted to let them tear each other apart, to let their greed humiliate them the way they had tried to humiliate him. But he had never been a cruel man. This wasn't about revenge. This was about proving his worth, about showing them that a man like him, a man they had dismissed, still had something they could never take away. The bidding soared past 200,000 before the tension reached its peak. It was down to two men, Davenport and a wealthy breeder named Walter Harrington, known for paying any price to get what he wanted. The room was dead silent as the auctioneer turned to Davenport. The man hesitated, then exhaled sharply. He shook his head. He was out. All eyes turned to Harrington, who sat stiffly, adjusting his cufflinks. He took a long, considering breath, then lifted his hand one final time. The room erupted. It was the highest bid of the night for the horse they had once called worthless. Henry's heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He had done it. He had won in the only way that mattered. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. "Sold, 350,000 to Mr." A murmur rippled through the room as the realization sank in. The same men who had laughed at Henry minutes ago were now watching in disbelief as his so-called worthless horse became the most expensive sale of the night. Harrington, a man known for his ruthless business sense, approached Henry with an air of quiet satisfaction. "You drive a hard bargain, Callahan," he said, extending a hand. Henry studied the outstretched hand but didn't take it right away. He glanced at Silver Dust, the horse that had been with him through droughts, losses, and heartbreak. Could he really let him go? For years, Henry had believed he had no choice, that selling Silver Dust was the only way to survive. But now, as he stood there with $350,000 within his grasp, something inside him shifted. It wasn't about the money anymore. These men saw Silver Dust as a trophy, but to Henry he was family. The room fell silent as Henry took a deep breath and turned to the auctioneer. "I've changed my mind," he said firmly. Gasps echoed through the hall. Harrington's expression hardened. "What, Callahan? That's absurd." Davenport and the other buyers whispered among themselves, stunned. "Who turns down that kind of money?" Henry let out a slow, steady breath. "You all spent the night trying to decide what he was worth," he said. But you never asked what he meant to me. Money comes and goes." With that, Henry turned and walked out of Blackwood Auction House, leading Silver Dust beside him. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of the world moving on. Behind him, the buyers stood in stunned silence, but Henry didn't look back. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: dignity, freedom, and a future he could still shape on his own terms. The crisp night air hit Henry's face as he stepped out of Blackwood Auction House, leading Silver Dust beside him. The sounds of murmuring buyers and shuffling feet echoed behind him, but he didn't stop or turn back. He had walked into that auction believing he had no choice, that survival meant selling the one thing that truly mattered to him. But tonight, he had proven something to himself and to every man in that room: some things are beyond price. As they walked down the dimly lit path away from the auction, Silver Dust let out a deep exhale, as if sensing the weight lifted from Henry's shoulders. "Looks like it's still just the two of us, boy," Henry murmured, running a hand along the stallion's gleaming coat. The thought of returning to his empty ranch had once filled him with dread, a reminder of everything he had lost. But now it felt like a new beginning. Before he could get far, footsteps approached from behind. The voice was sharp but not unkind. Henry turned to see Davenport, the same man who had mocked him earlier, standing with his hands in his coat pockets. "I won't pretend I wasn't wrong about you," Davenport admitted, his usual arrogance tempered. "Most men in your position would have taken the money and run, but you walked away." Henry studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I wasn't trying to prove a point," he said simply. Davenport exhaled, glancing at Silver Dust. He hesitated, then added, "I have an open position at my breeding farm. You'd have full control over Silver Dust's future. You wouldn't have to sell him, but I'd be willing to invest in you." For the first time in years, someone wasn't offering Henry charity or pity. They were offering respect. He had come here prepared to lose everything, and instead he was leaving with something far more valuable than money: a second chance. As Davenport walked away, Henry looked at Silver Dust, who stood patiently beside him, ears twitching in the cool night air. He muttered, and with that he led Silver Dust toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, it was a future he could believe in. The stars stretched across the dark sky as Henry walked toward the edge of town, Silver Dust's steady footsteps echoing beside him. He had arrived at Blackwood Auction House feeling like a defeated man, believing he had no choice but to sell the only thing that truly mattered to him. Now he was leaving with something far greater than money. The realization that he still had worth, that his story wasn't over yet. Davenport's offer lingered in his mind: a place to rebuild, a stable where Silver Dust could thrive, and a chance to prove that even an old rancher like him still had something to give. It wasn't just a job, it was a second chance. But trust wasn't something Henry gave easily. He had seen too many men like Davenport, men who valued power over loyalty. Could he really put his future in the hands of someone who had laughed at him just hours ago? As they reached the outskirts of town, Henry stopped and looked at Silver Dust. The stallion nudged his arm gently, as if sensing his hesitation. He murmured. The truth was, Henry wasn't afraid of starting over. He was afraid of hoping again. But if there was one thing he had learned tonight, it was that worth isn't measured in money, and respect isn't given, it's earned. With a deep breath, Henry turned around and walked back toward town. He wasn't going to rush into anything, but he owed it to himself and to Silver Dust to at least hear Davenport out. This wasn't about proving anything to the rich man at the auction anymore. It was about proving to himself that he still had fight left in him, that there was more to his story than just loss. By the time he reached Davenport's estate, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the rolling pastures. A stable hand greeted him, surprised to see him back. "Tell Mr. Davenport I'll talk," Henry said simply. He wasn't a desperate man begging for an opportunity. He was a man who knew his own worth. As Silver Dust lifted his head, Ears perked toward the morning light, Henry let out a slow, steady breath. This wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of something new. Henry stood at the entrance of Davenport stables, the smell of fresh hay and polished wood filling the crisp morning air. The estate was nothing like his old ranch. It was bigger, wealthier, meticulously maintained. Silver dust poured at the ground beside him, ears flicking as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Henry wasn't sure if he belonged here, but he knew one thing for certain. If he stayed, it would be on his own terms. A stable hand led him to Davenport's office, a large room lined with leather-bound books and framed photographs of champion horses. Davenport sat behind a grand oak desk, watching Henry with an expression that was harder to read than before. Gone was the arrogance from the auction house. Instead, there was something else, curiosity, maybe even respect. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Callahan," Davenport admitted, setting down a glass of coffee. Henry smirked slightly but didn't sit. "I'm not here to be anyone's employee," he said plainly. He let the words settle. "If I stay, I work silver dust my way." Davenport leaned back in his chair, studying him. Most men would have jumped at an offer like this, a chance to work in one of the finest breeding farms in the country. After a long pause, Davenport exhaled through his nose, then gave a slow nod. "Fine, you train him your way." There was no mockery in his tone this time, just a challenge, and Henry had never backed down from a challenge in his life. Henry finally took the seat across from Davenport. "Silver dust will prove it for me," he said simply. Davenport extended a hand, and this time Henry shook it, not as a man desperate for a lifeline, but as an equal. As he left the office, stepping out into the early morning sun, Henry ran a hand down Silver Dust's strong neck. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. The first morning at Davenport's stables was quiet except for the distant sounds of horses stirring in their stalls. Henry stood by the fence, watching Silver Dust move across the training paddock. Even without a saddle, the stallion's movements were smooth, powerful, the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught. A few stable hands had gathered nearby, watching with curiosity. They had heard the stories from the auction, the whispers about Silver Dust's legendary bloodline, but Henry didn't care about gossip. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to prove to himself and to everyone else that Silver Dust was more than just a name on a pedigree. Davenport approached, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the stallion. "He's something else," he admitted, his usual arrogance softened. "But I need more than just a good-looking horse, Callahan." Henry didn't look away from Silver Dust. "You'll get them," he said simply. Davenport smirked. With that, he turned and walked off, leaving Henry alone with his horse and his thoughts. Henry exhaled slowly, stepping into the paddock. Silver Dust lifted his head immediately, ears pricked, eyes bright. The connection between them had been built over years of trust. Henry had never needed force to guide him, only patience, understanding, and respect. As he approached, the stallion didn't flinch or move away. Instead, he stood tall, waiting. With that, Henry gave a subtle cue, and Silver Dust moved with effortless precision, responding to the lightest touch. He trotted, then cantered, his strides long and fluid, his hooves barely touching the ground. The stable hands murmured among themselves, impressed despite their skepticism. Even Davenport, watching from a distance, seemed unable to look away. After several minutes, Henry brought Silver Dust to a stop and patted his neck. "Good work," he muttered. The horse had nothing to prove, but Henry did. He knew that the rich men in this place still saw him as an old rancher past his prime, but they didn't know the fight he still had left in him. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the ranch, Henry led Silver Dust back toward the stables. This was only the beginning. Word spread quickly through Davenport's stables. Silver Dust wasn't just special, he was extraordinary. The stable hands who had once whispered behind Henry's back now watched in silent respect whenever the old rancher led the stallion onto the training grounds. Even Davenport, who had been skeptical at first, couldn't deny what he was seeing. But respect was one thing, proving silver dust's worth to the world was another. One morning, Davenport approached Henry near the paddock, arms crossed. "I have an offer for you, Callahan," he said. "There's a private race coming up. Elite breeders, investors, big money on the line." Henry let out a slow breath. He hadn't trained silver dust for competition. Their bond had never been about trophies or records, but deep down he knew this wasn't just about a race. This was his moment, not for Davenport, not for the men who had laughed at him at the auction, but for himself. The decision wasn't easy. Henry had spent years believing his time was over, that the world had passed him by. But if silver dust had taught him anything, it was that some things are worth fighting for. Finally, he looked up at Davenport and gave a small nod. "All right," he said. The following days were grueling. Henry trained silver dust harder than ever, but never with force, only trust. Every stride, every turn, every sprint was built on their unspoken bond. As the race day approached, the once forgotten rancher and his legendary horse were about to step into the spotlight. The night before the race, Henry stood by Silver Dust's stall, running a hand over his sleek white coat. "Tomorrow we show them," he murmured. "Not for the money, not for the glory." The stallion let out a deep, steady breath, as if he understood every word. The crowd buzzed with anticipation as the competitors lined up at the starting gate. Wealthy investors and elite breeders filled the viewing stands, murmuring about the unknown horse that had entered the race. Silver Dust stood among them, calm, steady, his coat gleaming in the morning sun. Henry adjusted the saddle with practiced hands, ignoring the doubtful stares from the other trainers. They still didn't believe he belonged here, but Henry didn't care. He wasn't here to prove himself to them, he was here to prove it to himself. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, and then the gates flew open and Silver Dust exploded forward. The other horses were fast, trained by the best breeders in the country, but Silver Dust ran like something untamed, something free. His strides were smooth, effortless, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. By the halfway mark, he was already gaining on the leaders. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered. Even Davenport, watching from the stands, leaned forward, his usual composure slipping. Henry kept his focus, whispering steady words to Silver Dust as they weaved through the pack. This wasn't about power, it was about trust. In the final stretch, the front runners pushed hard, hooves pounding against the dirt. But Silver Dust didn't falter. With a final burst of speed, he surged ahead, overtaking the led horse by a nose just as they crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted. Wealthy men who had once laughed at Henry now stood in stunned silence. As Henry dismounted, Silver Dust let out a triumphant snort. They had done it. Not just won a race, but rewritten the story that had been forced upon them. Henry wasn't a forgotten rancher. Silver Dust wasn't just a nameless horse. They were champions. And this time the world would remember their names. Davenport approached, shaking his head with something between admiration and disbelief. "You proved me wrong, Callahan," he said. Henry just smiled. He had walked into Blackwood Auction House believing he had lost everything. But now, standing beside the greatest horse he had ever raised, he knew the truth. He had never lost a thing. If you found this story of unexpected worth and quiet triumph inspiring, please show your support by subscribing to this channel. Your likes help others discover this content, and sharing it spreads a powerful message. Thank you for watching and believe he belonged here, but Henry didn't care. He wasn't here to prove himself to them, he was here to prove it to himself. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, and then the gates flew open and Silver Dust exploded forward. The other horses were fast, trained by the best breeders in the country, but Silver Dust ran like something untamed, something free. His strides were smooth, effortless, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. By the halfway mark, he was already gaining on the leaders. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Who is that horse?" someone muttered. Even Davenport, watching from the stands, leaned forward, his usual composure slipping. Henry kept his focus, whispering steady words to Silver Dust as they weaved through the pack. This wasn't about power, it was about trust. In the final stretch, the front runners pushed hard, hooves pounding against the dirt. But Silver Dust didn't falter. With a final burst of speed, he surged ahead, overtaking the led horse by a nose just as they crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted. Wealthy men who had once laughed at Henry now stood in stunned silence. As Henry dismounted, Silver Dust let out a triumphant snort. They had done it. Not just won a race, but rewritten the story that had been forced upon them. Henry wasn't a forgotten rancher. Silver Dust wasn't just a nameless horse. They were champions. And this time the world would remember their names. Davenport approached, shaking his head with something between admiration and disbelief. "You proved me wrong, Callahan," he said. Henry just smiled. He had walked into Blackwood Auction House believing he had lost everything. But now, standing beside the greatest horse he had ever raised, he knew the truth. He had never lost a thing. If you found this story of unexpected worth and quiet triumph inspiring, please show your support by subscribing to this channel. Your likes help others discover this content, and sharing it spreads a powerful message. Thank you for watching.